Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. I am your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very, very senior and accomplished coach from London, Mr. Toye Oshunbiyi. Toye, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you. Toye is the founder and CEO of Business Leaders Coach. So today we'll talk coaching with Toye. Toye, before I start, tell me a little bit about your own background and what got you started as a coach.
Yes. So first of all, Ashutosh, thanks for having me on your podcast. And I, my story goes like this. So earlier on in my career, I was put in a leadership position for a not-for-profit organization for my church, and I was overseeing about 100 people. And I just found it challenging knowing what to do. And so I remember picking up a book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and that got me to understand a bit more about how people are motivated. Habit number 1, be proactive. And then the second thing was walking into a store and picking up some videos by an author called John Maxwell. And I sat down and consumed all of them, and I began to understand the importance of leadership. Now, then I worked for a sales organization and then started to help out with some training. And then my wife and I, in 2006, went for a coaching course. And it was then that I came to understand the power of asking questions. And a year later, I started my own business, did that for a number of years, then went back into work for a bigger staffing company, was there for 11 years and coached a lot of the senior executives there. And then just recently started Business Leaders Coaches. That's sort of a snapshot of my journey of how everything came to be.
Fantastic. So, you just said that you realized the power of asking questions. So my next question to you is, what is coaching and how is it different from mentoring?
That's a brilliant question. Yeah. So I think, when we think about coaching, it is the ability to be able to facilitate the coachee's thinking and helping them to realize their own potential. Right. And the way you can do that is by asking brilliant questions, because I think one of the things that we realize is that we are so busy today that we don't have enough time to stop and think and reflect on where we are going. So I would define coaching as it gives the coachee the ability to realize their own potential that they already have, that they're not aware of. And that's what great coaching does. Now, the difference between that and mentoring is that people normally define a mentor as somebody who's been there, done that, walked the walk. And so the mentee is following in that path. But I think the coach doesn't necessarily need to have walked the walk in particular. It's always good if they have, but the facilitation of the thinking is more empowering for the coachee because that person comes to an awareness and can own it. And I think there's a difference in that. A good mentor should be a good coach as well.
Okay. Very well said. Well said. So, I've spoken to many coaches and I've asked this question from many of them. When I was growing up, which, I started working over 4 decades ago, mentoring or coaching, and I don't think there was a difference then, was either done by a family elder or someone senior in the organization who took a liking for you.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, what has changed over the years that coaching has now become a profession and people are willing to pay for it?
Yeah, you know what? It's interesting because as I mentioned about me starting my own business in 2007, at that time, coaching was a hard sell, to get people to convince them. But coming back to your question, I think that one of the reasons why coaching has become a lot more on the front of people's minds is because of neuroscience. I think there's a lot more understanding now about how our brains are wired, and I think that's just simply enhanced our understanding that as human beings, some of the things that I mentioned earlier about 7 Habits with Stephen Covey's be proactive. I think the understanding that the more we use our brain to be self-aware, the understanding about emotional intelligence, about being self-aware, self-managing ourselves. I think that's shifted the perspective. That's different from just training. In the past, we put a lot more emphasis on training. Now, because of the neuroscience about how our brains operate, I think it's simply helped us to understand that, wow, there's a lot that we can do if we're put in the right environment
Mm-hmm.
and partner with the right person that can ask us the right questions.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one of the main things. And obviously, in our new, the millennials of today, they're asking more questions. I think when we look at the environment that we're in, where you can get a lot of answers to things
Mm-hmm.
through Google, etc., I think it's simply just enhanced more of our awareness of things. So I think that that's one of the reasons. And just to add to that,
Mm-hmm.
you talked about back in the day, with the with the elder in the village,
Mm-hmm.
or that kind of
Mm-hmm.
culture. I think it still sort of exists, but it's on YouTube. You get my point? Like, people are still following people,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a different kind of way of how this is being materialized.
Well said. Well said. So, when you decide to accept a new coachee,
Mhm.
what do you look for?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I always look for is
Mm-hmm.
something that I'm calling a learner mindset,
Mm-hmm.
because we now are in a world, as I said, that there's a lot of information. So what I'm looking for is somebody who is eager to learn, eager to take responsibility,
Mm-hmm.
and also is committed to their own growth and their own development. And I think, again, that sort of shifts the perspective of the mentor and the coach, what you were saying earlier on,
Right.
because
Right.
if I go to the mentor, I'm almost expecting you as my mentor to give me the answer.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're having a relationship with a coach, then don't expect the coach to give you the answer. Expect the coach to ask you the questions. Now, if you don't have that kind of expectation of yourself, that I need to figure this out, I need to push myself into going into areas that are perhaps not as comfortable, then I don't think you're ready for coaching.
Mm-hmm.
And so those would be some of the criteria that I would look for: a learner mindset, which is that the person is, eager to be a self learner, a
Mm-hmm.
commitment, responsibility, and obviously taking ownership. Those would be
Wonderful.
some of the things that I would
Wonderful.
look for.
Great, great response. But now, my question to you is from the other side. What does a coachee look for to get a
Ooh.
good coach?
Well, I think at the end of the day, a coachee should look for somebody that can help them get results. I mean, if we go into the sporting world, I mean, it's kind of obvious. There's a goal that is that the coachee is trying to achieve,
Mm-hmm.
and so what they should look for is either evidence that they can produce that result,
Mm-hmm.
or the framework that they're going to help them with can help them get that result. And I think there's a bit of synergy there. I do believe that chemistry is important. Getting on well with the person, feeling relaxed is important. But yeah, if there was anything that at the end of the day, it should move them in the right direction
Mm-hmm.
that they want to go. So
Mm-hmm.
they should be looking for a coach
Mm-hmm.
that listens well. That'll be the first thing. So even if there's any kind of interaction with this person hear me, even if it
Mm-hmm.
was like a pilot kind of interaction, that should be some of the first things to look for. And then, do they have some kind of framework that's going to
Mm-hmm.
help them get the results that they're looking for? Those would be some key criterias.
Thank you. But think of it this way: that I'm a coachee
Mhm.
somewhere in the UK, and I know that I'm looking for a coach. How do I find out who to go to?
Oh, well, I guess that's where your network would be a good place
Mm-hmm.
to start off with.
Mm-hmm.
And I think going around through your network
Mm-hmm.
will be a good place to go to. Yeah, asking people
Mm-hmm.
who can help me in this area would be another way of figuring that out. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you're more likely to get a good referral through your network of
Mm-hmm.
somebody who can help you get those kind of results.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do need to engage with the professional body, then that might be fine. But bear in mind, that one of the things still is that when you do then interact with that person, does that person listen? Those criteria would then be the key thing. So even if you've been referred to as somebody, I would still say that you still need to look for those things that I've mentioned, which is about the person can listen, and
Sure.
because I think that's still important.
And then my next question to you, Toye, is how long should an association be for, a coaching association?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of debate about that,
Mhm.
and I think that at the end of the day, it should be as long as that person, the coachee, is able to get results. And I think that perhaps the relationship should start on something specific, with some of the relationships that I have, they start off with a particular area of that they want to, grow to the next level. But if that person is a learner, you find out that with the next, there's normally a next level.
Mhm.
So I think that the coachee and coach relationship should last as long as there's still new levels to conquer,
Mm.
and the coach that they're with can help them get there.
Mm.
Because I don't think that is every coach is necessarily the one that perhaps might enable you to get to where you want to get to. But if they can, then absolutely, it should be as long as that, and that's how I would determine it. That would be the right amount of time.
Yep. What a great response. So moving on, you must have worked with coaches who are top management, CXOs, getting into senior roles. What is the difference, if any, in coaching senior leaders and emerging leaders?
Yeah, yes. So there absolutely is a difference. I think the first thing is that with senior leaders, they've got a lot of experience. So the whole idea of asking powerful questions, and I would say being comfortable with a lot of silence, is important, because you really want to give them that space to dig deep into things that they've experienced and perhaps weren't aware of. And so that's the sort of journey with that, in that category of senior. Now there's also the right way to be able to challenge their thinking, which sometimes they might not always necessarily be used to, senior leaders. And sometimes that's the role of the coach, is to challenge their thinking, to take them out of that comfort zone. I think with younger managers, there's still in some cases some guidance, pointing them to some information. There's a phrase that I use, that if there's nothing in the tank, there's nothing in the tank. So sometimes when you are taking them down this route of questioning, if they haven't experienced it, then in some cases you do have to do more of the teaching or the training side first, so that they've got something there, and then they can use the framework appropriately. So that's the sort of the distinction that I use when I'm coaching these different categories. But things are changing now, I will have to say, that because we are now completely in a VUCA world, that even the senior leader has to unlearn
Correct.
what they used to learn, or what they knew was right, or what they thought was working. And I think that's sort of the challenge for them, is how do they unlearn what we used to work in the past, and to for them to embrace new ways of thinking. So they're becoming this sort of overlap, and that's partly the reason why sometimes you can have a younger leader even mentor a senior leader, simply because it's a new environment. It's a new world. So there is a bit of a difference, but then there's a place where I believe that they're beginning to merge.
Wonderful. So for my viewers and listeners, can you share one or two interesting coaching assignments that you've done, without any names, of course? What were the challenges and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think of one of the main sort of areas that I work with. So I work with CEOs and leadership teams that are going from startup to scale up. And so one of the specific areas that I've helped companies with is understanding the gap between what that's going to take. So with the senior leader, typically what I have done is to help them understand the importance of their own self-leadership. And so So we take them through a framework called Lead Yourself First, and them just identifying their own principles. And it's interesting that, with many, even senior leaders sometimes that I've coached, they haven't really figured out what their purpose is. And so that would be a really important, that's an important part that I've worked with. So to give you the example, is really helping this CEO to understand what their purpose was, and then working with the leadership team to craft that. And now they have a clear purpose, and they're actually using that to scale up. So now, as they're bringing in new people, they're using that as the engagement piece, to say this is what they're about. They're redefining their industry, and that's sort of their statement. And so I'm working with them now, as they're now with the second layer of leaders, to also help them to understand how to equip themselves, how to also then empower their own teams through a process called situational leadership. So those are some of the things that I would do. It's about them moving up to that next level and letting go of the level that they were on before. I call it the mindset shift that is needed when leaders are moving through the transition and also are growing their businesses.
Fascinating. So, Toye, my next question is about the millennials and the Gen Zs. Now most organizations have started to see millennials and Gen Zs getting into positions of leadership. As a coach, what is your perspective on how should an organization prepare itself to coach millennials and Gen Zs? Because these young people have a very, very different way of looking at things, very positive. And I've often told young people that I have a lot of faith and confidence in what you're doing. You're probably going to retrieve all the mess my generation made in this world.
Yes, it's interesting. Just last week, I was with a group of directors, and I asked them the question: what are they observing with this, the new generation, millennials, Gen Z? And one of the things that's, first of all, that we have to at least acknowledge is that they want to make a difference. It's definitely a generation that wants to make a difference. And so to answer your question about, so what's the key thing? That's the reason why I mentioned that this issue of businesses having a purpose, I think it's fundamental. So if we're going to really help, with this generation, that's the first place, which is that because they want to make a difference. So what's the difference between, helping them, or how do we help them? I think it's by helping them to engage with that, the purpose, first of all. And then secondly, is that there is an element of them being in a rush. And so the problem then is slowing down. And when I teach or train or coach this generation, I try as much as possible to pass on the principles of life, to say, look, you can't speed. There's certain things that you can't just speed up. It's just, it's the way life works. So I would normally say, embrace the principles of this and work on those principles, and then you see things work. And I think that's the message that needs to be cascaded to them, because I think that's that way they don't mess things up, if that makes sense.
Very interesting. So I'm now going to move to the next segment of our conversation. My viewers and listeners love to get to know my guest a little better. So I have time for 2 or 3 questions for you.
Yeah.
They're called personally, questions for you. You mentioned that you started off working with your church, and then worked for organizations and became a coach. My question to you, Toye, is what would you say are 3 key milestones or pivot points in your life?
Yeah. So, the first one has to be my faith. That's something that's important to me. It shaped my thinking. It shaped the decisions I make. That's important. That was definitely a milestone. The second is getting married and having children. And the having children part was because, unfortunately, my wife and I had 2 miscarriages that were quite late, and that shifted my perspective as well. Now we have 2 kids, 12 and 9, and we're grateful. But again, it's one of those life moments where that's a milestone about life. And then the third one would be what I mentioned about leadership
Mhm.
and just coming to this awareness of the power of leaders, in terms of the role they play, the impact they have, the influence they have in an organization. So those would be some of the milestones that when I look at my life and I think of
Mhm.
those,
Very interesting.
sliding door moments of
Very
what
interesting.
was, yeah.
Very interesting. And when you again look back at all the amazing things that you've been doing, um, and you said one of the key milestones is your faith. What are some of the core values you believe in?
Yeah, so I believe that in terms of what I really do believe that we are here to love. I mean,
Mm.
that's the ultimate goal. And I
Yeah.
think it's the simplicity of it makes it complex.
True. True.
Which is that if leaders loved more, their people, or things would be things would be sorted out. And I
Mhm.
mean, it's an easy thing to say, but it's a difficult thing to do. And I think
Correct.
that's partly the reason why we're in the world that we're in. So yeah, that's what I'll boil it down to.
Mm.
That. And I think with all that we're going through, if there was anything, is to have hope.
Mm.
That it's really important
Mm.
that no matter what's going on right now, that we look up and we have hope. And I think that's another way of defining a good leader. And I
Mm.
would say that is because the leader sees further than others. I think everybody should be a leader, in my opinion, but the distinguishing factor is when you can see further than others and you can
Mhm.
see hope ahead. I think it inspires other people, and I just want to play my own part in doing that. So those are some of the things that drive me.
Fantastic. Fantastic. My next question to you is again, as you look back at life, as you look ahead, what does success mean to Toye?
Oh. Well, I mean, that's a question that I have wrestled with a lot,
Hmm.
and my answer might disappoint people, but I believe that everybody's here, they've got an assignment, and so success is living out your assignment on this planet, living out your full potential, and it's a journey, and I think it's a journey of discovering your gifts, discovering the things that you come more natural to you. And it's not about yourself. It's then how do you then cascade that or pass that on to others? And so I definitely find that as my own definition of, so am I living my life to my full potential? Obviously it won't, the answer is not yes every time,
Mm.
but that's how I would define success is
Wonderful.
that journey.
Wonderful. Uh, and my last question to you is a follow up from success. Who or what inspires you?
Well, I mean, I've got to say it, as a person of faith, it's Jesus that inspires me. And not trying to be religious in any way, it's just the person
Yeah.
he is. Um, as I said, he emulates all the things that I've talked
Mhm.
about.
Mhm.
And I think that's the inspiration for me is to go and do likewise, doing good in the world, and I think the reason for Business Leaders Coach is actually to help build businesses that grow and flourish.
Mhm.
And the reason for that is because when organizations have great leaders,
Mhm.
what you'll find is that people talk about them in a great way around the dining table. It's the image that I have, and I've witnessed it myself.
Mhm.
Which is that when you train middle managers, you find out that they will talk about their leaders, and you can see
Mhm.
the difference between them that have been trained, that have been mentored or coached by a great leader, and you can see the opposite as well.
Mhm.
So that's my inspiration. He's my inspiration. Love is the key. Learning is the sort of ingredient, and
Mhm.
leadership is the metaphor to live it out. So I would say learning, loving, and leading are the sort of core values that I hold on to.
Wonderful. Learning, leading, and loving. On those three words, thank you, Toy, for speaking to me. Thank you
It's
for
been a pleasure.
talking to me at such length about coaching, talking to me about your personal beliefs on coaching and how you are making a difference to so many people. through your own knowledge, through your own learnings, and through your own experience. Thank you also for sharing with me some of your personal milestones. Thank you again, and good luck.
It's been a pleasure, and thank you so much for having me on your podcasts.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.